Canada of tomorrow will not be the Canada of yesterday or even today. To help us understand these possible differing visions for our country, 4 Big Ideas lecturers. In the nation's capital, John Ibbitson, Ottawa bureau chief at the Globe and Mail and co-author of the upcoming book, The Big Shift, The Seismic Change in Canadian Politics, Business and Culture and What It Means for Our Future. And back here in studio, Andrew Coyne, columnist with the National Post, Armine Yalnizyan, senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and John Duffy, principal at Strategy Corp. And it's good to have you 3 around the table here. And a hello to our friend, Mr. Ibbitson, in the nation's capital. And John, it is with you, John Ibbitson, that is, that I want to start tonight. Because we want to start with a little clip from the lecture that you gave last December about the demise of the so-called Laurentian Consensus. So watch this tape, everybody, and then we'll chat. Roll tape, please.
On May 2nd, immigrant Canadians, most of them of Asian background, along with other middle-class suburban, ex-urban, and rural Ontario voters, allied themselves with voters in Western Canada, forging a new Conservative coalition, shattering in the process the political voice of the Laurentian Consensus, the Liberal Party. So the only question remaining is, what is this new Conservative coalition, and who is it? It is, first of all, a coalition, not a consensus. The bonds between a Mississauga commuter, a prairie farmer, and an Okanagan vintner are too ephemeral at this point for us to describe them as one people with one worldview. So a coalition for now. Excluded from the coalition are the cultural elites of downtown Toronto. Margaret Atwood is not part of the Conservative coalition. Neither is just about anyone at Queen's. There are few, if any, leaders of the Conservative coalition to be found having lunch at the Rideau Club. The Toronto Star is not part of the Conservative coalition, nor is the CBC. And as for my newspaper, depends on the byline. The Labour movement is not at the table, or anyone who feels that the Occupy movement is getting to the question of income inequality. It's not a pressing concern inside the Conservative coalition. Anyone who believes global warming should be a top government priority outside the coalition. Most important, Quebec is outside the coalition, and this is fundamental.
Okay, John. That was very good, incidentally, John, I got to say. Very nice. We even chuckled at the studio here at some of your laugh lines. However, just as you are trying to pour dirt on the casket that is the Laurentian Consensus, I do need to mention that about 25 minutes ago, there was a guy named Trudeau who finished a kickoff speech to run for the leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada. Is the Laurentian Consensus, John, just refusing to go away despite your better efforts?
Well, first of all, it's my story and I'm sticking to it. But yes, this is a remarkably appropriate night to be having this discussion, at least in terms of my topic. The Laurentian Consensus is very much, perhaps nostalgically, but perhaps with a greater sense of forward momentum, trying to reconstitute itself, especially through the candidacy of Justin Trudeau and his bid for the leadership of the Liberal Party. I have advice for Mr. Trudeau. He should not listen to them. I don't yet believe that there is a progressive coalition available that can undermine and take away from the Conservative coalition that exists. Those Ontario middle-class suburban immigrant voters in alliance with the Western base is powerful and intact. I note that Mr. Trudeau may believe this himself because he is proceeding straight from Montreal to Calgary and then to Richmond outside Vancouver and then to Mississauga outside Toronto. I think he knows where the votes that win the elections are to be found, and they're in those places. Those people do not listen to the people that I talked about in that talk. They do not listen to the Laurentian Consensus. To be frank, they don't listen to us. And if Mr. Trudeau is smart, he won't listen to us either.
Well, speak for yourself. I do hope that he tunes in at some point and watches this broadcast. But is it your view that See, it seemed to me like he was trying to, as he was giving his speech, reject the Laurentian Consensus as you attempt to bury it as well, because he wasn't saying things like the Liberal Party built this country and failed. He went out of his way to say it wasn't the Liberal Party that represented the Laurentian Consensus that built this country. It was Canadians that did so. So do you think he's also, in some respects, a kindred spirit with you on this?
Well, I think anyone who is looking at where this country is headed from Atlantic to Pacific, from Europe to Asian, the diversity of the great cities and the suburbs surrounding them, knows that this is where the political as well as the cultural and business future of the country resides, and knows that this is where you have to go one way or another to win it. I think you see it in Tom Mulcair's Dutch disease, which I'm sure we'll be talking about later, an argument that tries to create perhaps an Ontario Quebec coalition in opposition to it, but nonetheless it recognizes that this new reality, this suburban Ontario married to the West reality, must be taken into account by anyone who wants to govern this country, especially anyone who wants to replace Stephen Harper as Prime Minister. And I think Mr. Trudeau, in galvanizing a new generation of youth, in specifically appealing to the middle class the way he did throughout his speech, and in heading straight west to try to rebuild the bridges that were burned so long ago by the Liberal Party, gets this message too.
So John Duffy, you as a guy who spent some time supporting the Liberal Party over the years, if there are those who would like to see Justin Trudeau's candidacy as a kind of a, I don't want to say last gasp, but let's say another gasp for the Laurentian Consensus, would they be wrong to do so?
I think they would. I think, and I'm going to honor John Ibbitson by being the first to say things this way, I think Trudeau is trying to be the first post-Laurentian Liberal. An awful lot of what John eloquently and accurately described as the mechanics of the Laurentian Consensus, not just its regional coalition, but the way it operated, the whispers in the common rooms at Queen's, the easy murmurings at the Rideau Club, the things that happen in a cafeteria at the Place du Portage, Civil Service Benevolent Society meeting. That way of doing business is gone, and that was a very important part of what John described. I think Justin Trudeau is outside of that world, outside of that group. He's got one or two tenuous links to it through his family and one or two of his advisors, but it's not the world he's reaching for. It's also not the electorate, the electoral composition, I think, that is part of his mind map. I think Justin Trudeau is as much reaching out to people who do not vote and people who have not yet voted, younger people, and also to new Canadian communities who have felt outside things, much more than he is trying to reconstitute the Liberal operation of even 10 years ago that I'm familiar with from my time working for Paul Martin. Trudeau is definitely, there's an era of next, post, onward, forward to everything that he says, and I think he's quite sincere about it. So whether that, I believe it actually confirms John's thesis of what's dead, is that old style, but it also points to the fact that a post-Laurentian world need not necessarily be a conservative one.
It's hard to imagine there could be a less relevant poll than one that comes out 3 years before the next election. But what the heck, guys? Let's have a little fun here, shall we? This is from Forum Research, published in your newspaper, Brother Coyne, and it's got, what if Justin Trudeau were the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada as the question, and here's what they churned out. The Liberals, who were, I believe, at 19% on the last election day, suddenly jump up to 39%. The Conservatives, who were at 39, are down to 32. And the NDP, who were at 30% in the last election, dropped 10 points, and they're at 20. Okay, we know what Deef said about polls being for dogs, but still, there seems to be some kind of appetite there that this poll speaks to. Do you want to acknowledge that?
Maybe. You're just trying to get me in trouble with my employer here, because the poll's worth nothing.
I think I said that, didn't I?
The poll is a snapshot. Yeah. It is the triumph of celebrity, and some of us would say that the candidacy at this point is the triumph of celebrity and paternity. All of these things that my learned colleagues have been saying about what Justin represents, I'll wait and see. It seems to me a bit much to be reading too much on the basis of one day and one speech. But you're right to say that we have seen repeatedly in election after election in recent times, not just federal but provincial, that the electorate can be mobile. It's not as set in its ways as it would have been 20, 30, 40 years ago, where you voted the way your parents did, et cetera. One element of that, unfortunately, is celebrity and name recognition, but a more charitable interpretation is people are looking for people who can articulate meaning in politics. And they go back and forth in that, however, because there's always a contest between people who can articulate the vision and the meaning and people who will deliver the meat and potatoes. And so we'll see, come election day, as you say, 3 years from now, which of those triumphs. I suspect that when it comes down to a contest between the two, people will choose the meat and potatoes, whichever party represents that.
You and I watched the speech together, and we both commented on how the charisma just sort of blasted right out of the television screen, although, you know, we'll see what else is there. And I wonder if you would, clearly you're not a fan of the current government or the current Prime Minister in terms of policy, and I wonder if you would be disappointed to see Stephen Harper defeated by charisma as opposed to better policies.
I think a failure of substance to deal with the big issues of our day would be a problem for all Canadians, irrespective of what our political leanings are. I think the interesting thesis that John Ibbitson puts forward, that the consensus has changed, is right and it's wrong. It's right in the sense that Canada is part of a global supply chain now, and we are being pulled from Asia, and we are part of a bigger thing that's happening, and Generation Next has been cut out of it, and somebody needs to speak to all the people that aren't spoken to when you've got the apparatchiks making all the decisions. But where I think he's a little bit wrong is that 39% of the population that voted Conservative, and only 60% of the population voted. That means less than a quarter of Canadians brought in this new consensus. I think more what's happening is that's where the money is. What's happening is this, because of globalization, because of the global supply chain, Canada has what the rest of the world wants, which is natural resources, in particular bitumen at the moment, and other ore-rich substances. And therefore, what the government is doing is actually the opposite of consulting with the next generation and moving out and tapping into what's needed out there. It's a strictly business as usual, meat and potatoes. Where's the money? Where's the foreign direct investment going to come from? And we're actually, whereas the Conservatives got in on the West wants in ticket, and the West is definitely in now, it's not like the West is in, Harper's in, and it is one of the most closed governments we've ever seen.
John.
I just want to back that up a little bit in just trying to put some daylight between the eclipse of the old order and where we are now. Armine's point is backed up perhaps helpfully with a little bit of statistical evidence, and I did an analysis of this just when John was on doing his Big Ideas lecture, which I attended and I loved, and I thought it was really enlightening. Harper government operates with about 21% of all of the men, women, and children in Canada voting for it. Trudeau governments, to use sort of old conventional majorities that we knew well from times gone by, operated at about 26% of the whole population.
So does that make it dramatically less legitimate?
I'm not talking about legitimacy, but it is market, sure. I mean, that's a 20%, 25% drop.
Right.
And it's an increased amount of leverage. And that's one of the reasons why Harper governments never really feel like a majority unless you're right in the face of it in the House of Commons. I think still there is a degree to which, for all the power they've got with majority power in Ottawa, there's a degree to which the Harper government governs as though it has to exert a lot of force and pressure to lever the outcomes that they want, because they don't have as broad a base as traditional governments do in Canada that have majorities.
John Ibbitson, let me give you the last word on this segment, and we'll throw to Armine's clip. Go ahead, please.
Well, I think there's an alarming degree of consensus forming amongst us. And John, I will certainly steal the first post-Laurentian Liberal line, if you don't mind.
I don't mind, John.
But I think we are, if anything, in a murky world right now where we're not exactly sure where the coalition lines are, especially where immigrant voters are. We know that they switched from the Liberals, which they've been at for generations, to the Conservatives. We have some idea why. Darryl Bricker in our book talks about the value shift from immigrants of the past to immigrants of the present, who are more conservative. In that sense, it is a more conservative electoral base. I don't buy John's argument that a market share determines whether a government is legitimate or it's not. It's a majority government. I do buy the notion, though, that the Conservatives always govern as though at any moment somebody's going to come out and grab it from them, even when they're in a majority situation. That is just the nature of their beast.
Okay. We're going to play excerpts from all of your Big Ideas speeches, which took place at the Gardner Museum over the past year. And Armine, you're up next. And you spoke about the social and political implications of rising levels of inequality. So let's hear a bit from your talk, and then we'll chat. Roll tape, please.
As incomes, wealth, and power get more concentrated in the hands of a few than at any time since the 1920s, people are rightly calling this the rise of the new plutocracy. And it is a troubling trend, not just because people have more money, not just because it is unfair. It's troubling because it affects justice and it corrupts democracy. The growing concentration of income, wealth, and power changes how influence is distributed. It permits a handful of people to shape the rules of the game. for their own benefit while they proclaim this is all about the public interest. Growing inequality, in fact, changes the rules of the game, how the game is played, and most importantly, how the story about how the game was played is told to the rest of us. How commonly do you think it's understood that the 25,000 richest Canadians grabbed a third of all the growth from the best decade of economic growth we've enjoyed for over a generation? How common do you think it is understood that 13 million taxpayers at the bottom of the income spectrum and their children shared less than a quarter of that growth?
Okay, Armine, I want to follow up with you to see how much you think this country would be different if the political priorities of the country and of the government would be different if people had a better understanding about the unequal distribution of wealth in the country.
I think they'd be more engaged in the political process instead of writing it off. I think the best thing that can happen to the plutocracy is people go, oh, those politicians, they all suck, couldn't care less about it. That's exactly what they want, because actually the plutocrats understand the power of government, the power of writing the rules, and in whose favor those rules can be written and enforced. And many of us just walk away from the political process thinking, this is a mug's game, they're all fools, we hate them all, a pox on all their houses. In fact, if you don't like democracy, get engaged and change it.
So a lack of engagement is a vote for the status quo, and the status quo, you think, is killing us.
No, actually, quite the contrary. A lack of engagement means that the status quo will get shifted more and more into the hands of those who own things, whether those are powerful corporations, including multinationals, including state-owned enterprises from other jurisdictions, that other people will look after their interests, and the vast majority of Canadians will not have their interests looked after, because the most vocal are the ones that have most of the power and the ability to massage the information and spread it out there as if that's in your interest too.
Andrew, how do you see the impact of the rising inequality in our politics in Canada today?
Well, I don't agree that there's a huge rise in inequality. You know, we used to talk about inequality in terms of the poor, in terms of the people at the bottom, the poverty level. The rate of poverty measured by StatsCan's low-income cutoff, which is often criticized for being a moving target, but so take that as being on the side of the, if you're looking for inequality, has gone down from 15% to 9% over the last decade. It's the lowest level it's been since 1976. So we don't talk about that anymore. They used to talk about inequality in terms of the division between rich and poor across a no man's line where the middle class is being hauled out. There's no middle class. It's just two armed camps. You look at the measures of the fifth of the population, how much of the income they take, it's stayed static for the last 20 years. It hasn't changed. So now, so instead the conversation shifts, because they can't make the case on those things, to a handful of people at the very top. In this case in Canada, about the top 1%, and really in fact it's the top 1/10 of 1%. And it's taken as given that we should begrudge them that. Well, no, I'm sorry. I want to know how they earned the money. If they earned it illegitimately, if they grabbed it, as Armine said, that'd be one thing. If they earned it by selling products that people want to buy or by doing useful services, I'm not going to begrudge them that. I'm certainly going to want to know what they do with the money. Do they put it into charity? Do they invest in useful companies? Or do they just spend it all on themselves? But the mere fact that they're earning the money, it seems to me, is a pretty barren and empty premise. So no, I don't agree that there's some terrible increase in inequality. If you want to know where the power is in the stock markets nowadays, it's not with a few handful of plutocrats, it's the pension funds. Who do the pension funds represent? The workers who are the membership and the beneficiaries of those pension funds.
You want to come back on that?
Yeah, I would love to, actually. I actually found the column that you wrote last fall, almost a year ago today, quite interesting. And, you know, the fact is that even your column showed that median family incomes are today lower than they were in 1976. And when you consider...
We had two recessions between 1980 and 1992. But I'm not going to let people play with numbers. There was two recessions between 1980 and 1992. That's going to cause all kinds of harm. Since 93, we had almost 20 years of uninterrupted growth. Median family incomes are up 20% after inflation. We got inflation down, unemployment down to 6% before the last recession. We got the employment rate up to an all-time record high. So to continue to try to construct this as some kind of bad news story, it just requires contorting the facts.
I would like to get in. So median family incomes are actually not only stagnant, but down from where they were in 1976. In 1976, we had fewer people with less education, fewer earners per family with less education. education. So we've played the girls are working just as hard as the boys card. We're playing the get an education because that's going to get you ahead card, and people are pedaling faster just to stay in the same place. So I'm going to ask you, Andrew Coyne, where are you going to find, there's fewer jobs in the middle, between the $30,000 and the $60,000 mark. There's fewer jobs in that band that are out there in the labor market, plus the labor market policies we are now introducing are flooding the low wage end of the labor pool. So we're just continually dragging down the range of opportunities for the next generation. Every collective bargaining table, now the new normal is a two-tier wage system. You're fine. If you're hired now, you're okay. But the next generation of people that are going to get hired, lower wages, lower benefits, lower pensions. But the economy is growing. So how are we going to explain to the next generation that there's no middle class for them, or a much smaller one? How are we going to explain that the rungs on the ladder to go from the bottom to the top are getting further apart? And with respect to your poverty analysis, it's true that the low-income cutoff that you have used, which used to be the gold standard for measuring poverty, shows that that poverty has declined since 1996. Well, 1996 was the high watermark. So if you're going to start that as your benchmark, if you compare it to 1989, we're kind of where we were in 1989. And if you start using the measure of poverty that is being used now internationally, the low-income measure, you'll see that since the mid-1990s, poverty, whether you're talking about working-age population, seniors, or children, has been on the rise. So start using it in a way that we compare it to the rest of the world. We got nothing to crow about.
One more comeback, Andrew.
The StatsCan LICO was the one that every poverty organization in Canada has used as the gold standard over the protests of people like me who said it's a moving target. It continues to rise as incomes rise.
Because it's based in 1992 and it hasn't been rebased
it's now,
since
contrary to the
1992.
statements you've just heard, it's at the lowest level at least since 1976.
It's not
and
the measure
probably
that's
before
being
that.
used anymore.
Well, then we'll use other measures, and I can assure you the measures will also show one-half median income will
I'm
also
happy
show.
to send
Market
you-
basket measures
I'm
will also
happy to send
show.
you the charts.
Anyway, the point is what we're looking at in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years is not going to be unemployment. It's going to be labor shortages. When we're having the working age population shrinking as a proportion of the population, we're going to be searching for every available person hour of work. So unemployment was last generation's problem. That's not the problem looking forward. Workers, people going into the workforce in the next 10, 20 years are going to be in a very good position in terms of getting jobs. The difficulty is going to be they're going to be having to pay for yours and mine pensions and health care.
Yeah, but you know what Jesse Jackson used to say, we had full employment under slavery too. Just because you have a job doesn't mean that you've got a living wage.
Let's get John Ibbitson to break the tie here. John, you want to come in on this?
Not a chance on that, no. But there was one earlier point that I do agree with, and that is the notion that there is an elite that continues to understand the power of politics. There are still 30-year-olds who are reading The Economist because they know that if they read The Economist, it gets them to the corner office. But there are a whole lot of 30-year-olds who don't read The Economist or the Globe and Mail or the New York Times, or who don't vote because somehow they see it as a gesture of protest or indifference not to vote. These are the people who are disenfranchising themselves, whether it's not voting or whether it's not reading newspapers or watching this show. Too many people are allowing themselves to be removed from the public square, from the market, and Armine is absolutely right that as they lose their influence, as they cease to vote, and as they cease to participate in the body politic, it just does allow fewer and fewer people with more and more power to exploit the system. To that extent, I do concur.
Okay, John Ibbitson decided to take the fifth on the argument at the table here. Do you want to weigh in on it, John Duffy?
Well, I don't want to get caught in that crossfire. It's epic, and I wouldn't want to deprive your viewers of more shootout. I should probably just cede my time. But I will say this. I guess my own perspective on it is that whoever's right in this, and I expect there's a measure of wisdom in what both are saying. The way I view it is really summed up in the phrase that the middle class hasn't gotten a raise in about 25, 30 years.
Can politics do something about that?
Well, I think it can. I think we've been through some of the worst of deindustrialization and a huge, massive shift of manufacturing power, which was the source of so many middle-class families' lifestyles and way of life. I think there is great potential now as the world reforms into new supply chains and new configurations for Canadian traditional manufacturing communities and the families who rely upon them to get back in the game with suitable support from governments. At the same time, I think that governments are going to have a devil of a time wrestling with what Andrew's talking about. The future, could very much look like Japan, not in the sense of exciting participation in global supply chains and lean manufacturing. It could look like an inverted demographic pyramid where a very small number of people of working age are working their hearts out to support a very large number of people who are no longer able to participate in the paid workforce.
Stagnant growth rates for
yeah,
years.
and so you ask yourself, maybe not so much which Canada do you want, but which Japan do you want? And it's almost a race between those two dynamics. And families that find themselves on the sunny side of them in a great lean manufacturing Toyota-style operation are going to do well, and families that find themselves on the outside of that could have real problems.
Quick comeback?
I don't think it's true to say that incomes haven't been rising. As I say, they were rising over that 20-year, almost 20-year period from 92 to 2007. The problem is that they've been rising on the basis of two things: rising commodity prices, which we can't take for granted, and more people working. So we need to get the productivity, the amount of output per worker up. That's going to be one of the preeminent challenges for the next 50 years.
Okay, 2 down, 2 to go.
But surely one
Brother
of the...
Coyne, John Ibbitson, stand by, because I want to make sure we get enough time to go through the glorious and ebullient presentation that Brother Coyne made not too long ago on economics without ideology. Roll tape, please.
If the most serious financial crisis in 75 years has not been enough to stir substantial interest in alternatives to the current economic model, perhaps we should conclude it's here to stay. Perhaps the most enduring effect of the crisis, rather than breaking up the consensus, will be to confirm it. For all the talk of increased polarization in Canadian politics, the evidence, in fact, points to a growing convergence, at least on the economy. Differences remain between the parties, but not, I submit, of the fundamental kind, whatever their rhetoric to the contrary. I think we have to consider the possibility that the consensus is permanent, that in the coming decades, politics will no longer be defined by economics in the way that we've known it. Nobody, left or right, wants to nationalize major industries anymore, and nobody, right or left, would deprive the poor of schooling or healthcare or any of the major undertakings of the modern welfare state. I don't mean to say that the economy will not come up as an issue now and again, or that we won't have any debates about economic policy, but they will be debates essentially about details. Both sides will be working off of a common model. The argument will be about how it should be tweaked and how applied.
Do you notice that even when he's wearing a tie, that top button never gets done up? You notice it? Huh. Okay, and if I remember the last federal election, which wasn't that long ago, a year and a half or so, the most vehement disagreements among the political parties seeking people's votes seemed to be about 2.5 points on the corporate tax. The breadth of the economic arguments in this country, as you've suggested, has gotten pretty pinched. And yet the debates over the narrowness of the range of issues seems to be as vehement as ever. Can you explain that to us?
Maybe there's a link between the two. It's like that old line about, academic policies are so vicious because the stakes are so small. I'm joking, of course, but I think we've certainly seen from at least one side an emphasis on partisanship over ideology in recent times, which is not terribly healthy. What is truer, though, in a broader frame is that both the Conservatives and the NDP have moved a long way from their previous positions 20, 30 years ago, leaving less room for the Liberals, of course. That's one of the dilemmas facing the Liberals. And I would suggest that that's not likely to change. It's partly a function of the collapse of communism, of course. Go back, they want to the big picture. All of politics across the Western world has narrowed since then. But more importantly, you're looking at things like, as I mentioned, the aging of the population. That's going to give us relatively less leeway for huge, big policy debates. The globalization, the emphasis on international markets, that constrains government's freedom of action. So we've seen a narrowing of that debate that I think is going to continue. It strikes some people as troubling because that's what we grew up with, the idea that politics was supposed to be about huge and fundamental divides in ideology. But if you go back in the longer view to the 19th century, the 18th century, politics was not always about the economy. It was about things like advancing enfranchising the working class. It was about the rights of religious dissenters. It's entirely possible that if politics was not always about economics in the past, it might not be in the future. Other issues might take its place, like the environment or global governance or other issues.
John Ibbitson, can you, as a guy who watches this every day from your perch there in the nation's capital, help explain to us and to our viewers why the debate seems so vehement over a range of issues that seems increasingly narrow?
No, I can't, because I don't agree.
Oh.
This is one area where Andrew and I have diverging views, and we've been offering them in our respective publications. I believe that, in fact, there are still big fundamental political issues at stake. I believe, for example, that this is an emphatically conservative government. Incrementally, but nonetheless emphatically. Whether it's how they develop resources, or whether it's how they approach pensions, or whether it's how the changes they're making to employment insurance, whether it's their trade policies. I think their law and order initiatives. I think on a broad variety of fronts, the Harper government is changing the country. For better or for worse, you can debate, but it is changing the country. It is not just a John Manley government under a different name, let's say. And I think, I mean, Andrew talks about the fact that the liberal democratic consensus is there, and indeed it is, and it's just a question of redistribution of whatever wealth gets generated. But that's a heck of a question. Who redistributes the wealth to whom, who gets it, who loses it, and what party is in charge of that redistribution is everything in politics. And it's still a very, very big deal. To go back just very briefly to the previous topic, we can all surely agree, whether we're on the left or the right or wherever we are, that there were an awful lot of jobs available after the Second World War, semi-skilled, unionized manufacturing jobs that were there for life and created a very comfortable and indeed progressive society, and they're gone. And as Andrew says, we are creating a new economy in which none of those semi-skilled, semi-educated jobs are available anymore. We have to find new ways of filling those jobs and generating the necessary wealth to pay for taxes. These are big things, and I just cannot believe for a minute that the narcissism of small differences is what governs federal politics today.
Okay, if those are big things, let me ask a bigger question then to Armine, and that is that in all of your travels through the various economic debates the world's been having over the last half a decade as we've been going through this great recession and trying to come out of it, have you yet seen an alternative to basically free market economics, hopefully with a heart, but not always, but hopefully? Seen anything out there?
No, where I would agree with Andrew is that there isn't so much a contest in terms of how do you organize the allocation of resources, that market dynamics and price signals are still the most favored. The question then becomes, how do you intervene in market failure? The collapse of 2008 being the classic turn the governing orthodoxy on its head of more market, less government. Suddenly we needed markets to be bailed out by governments. And then as soon as that happened, get them out of their way again. Where I would disagree that even the corporate income tax reduction fight was small-minded is that we are talking here about several big issues. First of all is, how do governments that have bailed out the market deal with their own fiscal hole? And is the way to do it to continue to cut taxes? I mean, there is a genuine debate out there that cutting taxes will stimulate the economy, specifically cutting corporate taxes, will stimulate the economy and you'll more than make up for it in more activity. Or whether that's actually foolishness, that's just opening up a bigger leak at a time when you're trying to plug the hole and add more water into the money bucket. So that's a genuine economic debate. And whether we were fighting over 2 or 3 silly little percentage points, it was about the direction in which, how do you fix a massive fiscal problem that everybody's facing. We're seeing it now in Europe with austerity. No, not austerity. Austerity actually not only didn't fill the bill in terms of dealing with the deficit, it made deficits wider because it introduced fiscal and economic drags. And so now they're trying a taxation, a revenue raising mechanism in some countries. But there's also other really big issues. Not only how do we redistribute the growth that we create, but what is the source of growth? So if Canada is part of a global supply chain, the Nexon CNOT deal and the test of net benefit is actually an important big economic debate. Mm-hmm. And part of what does it mean for a country to be part of a global supply chain? Do you give up control over the creation of value added? Do you give up control over strategic assets and things like an energy policy in a world where, as Barack Obama said in 2008, whoever wins the energy game wins the global growth game. If you can't figure out where your energy is coming from, you can't propel your way into the future. So there are some big economic issues that will still propel our conversation beyond the demographic and the income inequality fights, which will also condition economic discussions to be quite political, I think.
John Duffy.
I think what Armine's saying is also demonstrating and showing us a bit of where the debate is going. And I think in a way it sort of confirms what Andrew is saying. The dynamics that Armine is pointing to in the really existing world of global energy supply and pipelines and resource extraction are very real and substantial things. They're also in the realm of ideas, in the realm of political thinking and political discourse. They are the big new ideas that have really walked on the stage really only since the 1970s. I mean, the first oil shock came only, 40 years ago, around exactly the same time as Paul Henderson scored the goal, which was the big event of the year. And since then, we have seen the politics of energy and the politics of resources, and then laterally the politics of the environment and of the planet, come to the fore, not only in terms of government policy making and sometimes political issues, but they've really been the next big idea in the academic thinking about politics and in political discourse. So you go to Europe, which is really long on political discourse. It's a remarkable number of political scientists. The green paradigm swept the academic study of politics 30 years ago. And really, a lot of European political thinkers are arguing that's the first big new idea since socialism to come along. At the same time, you talk to a younger political scientist, I have the privilege of spending a lot of time with some of these people, they'll all say the big debate is extractivist governments, like Peru's, Ecuador's, and Canada's, who extract commodities from the planet, versus environmentalist and conservationist governments. My view happens to be that we're going to see more of these paradigms about extraction and conservation, about the politics of energy, and about equality issues within those things, but that these are going to be more and more the things that we talk about instead of the debates that Andrew and I and Armine and Ibbitson all grew up on, which were the role of government in the direct management of the economy and socialism versus capitalism. So I think it's shifting.
Yalnizyan, then Coyne.
Okay, so one of the other big issues that has come onto stage actually even more recently than since the 1970s is this big wave of corporate concentration that is sweeping the world in the wake of the recession. So you're getting fewer and fewer corporate giants in fields like media, retail, mining, food production. These are, and banking. And this is going to condition also a discourse around the economy that looks eerily like the 1920s and 30s, where great degrees of instability were generated by having small numbers of giant players. We talked about it with too big to fail in terms of the banks, but it's not just the banks that are too big to fail. Sometimes we're dealing with companies that are really too big to fail, whether it's healthcare or food production, for example. And so I think one of the subtexts on the economic debates du jour is going to be how big is too big, and do we just let the free market rip? And do we have to introduce things like the Glass-Steagall Act for the banking sector? Do we have to have more regulation to prevent the wobblies from, like the tail from wagging the dog when things become unstable? Looks an awful lot like the 1920s and 30s, actually.
Andrew.
If you actually look, though, at what's happening in the financial regulation post-financial crisis, it is as much about cleaning up the damage done by previous regulations as anything else. Getting rid of too big to fail, for example, which was a classic case of statism encouraging all kinds of excessive risk-taking. But that's what's on the agenda for people like Mark Carney. You know, all these things are questions of degree, questions of relative comparison. But if you look at some of the debates we had in the past over free trade, for example, free trade used to be an absolutely, incredibly controversial idea. Balancing the budget. Jean Chrétien got elected in '93 saying we can't balance the budget, it would cause a civil war. Zero inflation or low inflation used to be a very controversial idea. So in some senses here you have what Milton Friedman used to call the tyranny of the status quo actually working to the free marketer's advantage. John talked about the spread of the environment and how that's become one of the major issues of our times, and I think that obviously that's true. Part of that is because the language in which environmentalists talk has changed. It used to be very much what was called command and control. It was a very regulatory heavy agenda, but you have a whole generation of environmentalists who've grown up who understand the role of prices and markets and competition and private ownership in encouraging more responsible environmental stewardship. I think it's a great missed opportunity, frankly, for people on the right who could have seized upon that and said, look, this, if you like what the markets can do for you in the environment, can we interest you in what it can do for you in the healthcare or the education fields? It stresses the idea that markets are social institutions and not simply the arenas for private gain.
Let me come full circle, though, and give the last word to you on this section, then we'll go on and talk about John Duffy's piece. The Conservatives won the last election. They also apparently won the debate on whether to cut corporate taxes or raise them or leave them where they were. They did cut corporate taxes. Actually, the McGuinty government in Ontario did as well. We didn't get any new jobs for those corporate tax cuts. Would you agree that companies just got richer and more people didn't get hired?
Well, First of all, the point of cutting corporate taxes is not to get more jobs. Anybody who says that doesn't understand the case. The case is to get more investment and more productivity in the long run. It's not about some instant fix where you get lower unemployment. That's the case.
That's how it was sold.
Well, it's not that I can't be accountable for how people do it in the political arena. What any economist worth his salt will tell you is it's not about lower unemployment. It's about raising productivity, and it's not about a short-term thing. It's a long-term agenda. So I can't respond to you by saying an argument that I wouldn't make to begin with.
You want to fast back on this?
I still have a fridge magnet from the 1990s that says tax cuts create jobs. That was the Mike Harris era. I had a conservative representative. They still talk that line, Andrew. That's the way they sell it to the body public. Okay. The moral suasion is we get tax cuts and therefore we get more economic activity which creates jobs.
I'm not here to speak for political parties. All I can tell you is what economists will tell you is it's not about lowering unemployment. It's about raising productivity. And that the effect of tax cuts has to be taken into account with every other factor that affects productivity. You know, it's as with anything else, it's other things being equal.
So it doesn't make productivity. As an economist,
make for good fridge magnet slogans or bumper stickers. It's more to do with the hard work of economic analysis.
We could spend all of John Duffy's time talking about this, but alas, we should let Mr. Duffy back clean up here, as he is wont to do. Okay, here's John Duffy talking about politics and technology in his piece to the Gairdner Museum and Big Ideas. Roll tape, please.
A certain iteration of technopolitics, which is where we'd start, is a clash between urban and rural. And it's coming to dominate our electoral landscape, certainly in North America. Recent elections on both sides of the border have seen green appeals to urban voters from progressive parties and offerings to rural voters from center-right parties that explicitly put the environment in the back seat. A few examples are the federal Liberal Green shift in 2008, the U.S. Democrats' proposed offshore drilling ban that year, the Harper government's rejection of Kyoto, the current battle over the Keystone and Gateway projects in both Canada and the U.S., the list goes on and on. Now, when you put the cultural values and the economic interests together, and you see those clashes, the vastness of the disagreement between urban and rural right now becomes clear. What they are disputing is relentless urbanization, the retreat of the rural way of life, the husbanding of rural resources to the imperatives and sustainability of the city, the eclipse of the rural value system built around self-reliance. They are arguing, in fact, about modernity.
Justin Trudeau, in his kickoff announcement tonight, also, I don't know if he was referencing your speech directly.
I'm sure he was.
But, oh, come on, I'm trying to toss you a bone here, kid. But he did talk about future Liberal Party leadership, meaning him, making policy based on facts, based on science, as opposed to here's what we're going to do and hopefully the facts will fit what we want to do. You've talked about a future where the divide will be between those who are open to science and technology and empirical evidence and those who are against it. Want to just help us understand that divide as we look forward?
Sure. I mean, the idea of science-based policy and evidence policy is a loose term that the Liberal Party has lately adopted. I think Raymond Garneau walked it in, Bob Ray ran with it, and now Justin's moving with it pretty hard. At a surface level, it simply means try to be objective and use evidence rather than ideology to make your decisions. It's really no different from Deng Xiaoping 40 years ago saying we should have truth from facts, okay? But there's something deeper. I just finished reading and reviewing for the Literary Review of Canada, who also sponsored with TVO these wonderful talks that my colleagues were part of, a really interesting book about the regulation of biotechnology in Canada by two of the country's leading political scientists. There's a huge pile of work being done out there about the politics of science and technology. And you see a tiny sliver of an ice cube worth of iceberg above the surface when Mr. Trudeau knocks off a line like that. What's underneath it is almost a continent worth of academic thinking about this vast explosion of technology that we're having. Sorry about the mixed metaphors. The enormous challenge that it's confronting our society with, the utterly ungoverned nature of most of this change relative to our tiny political attention span that we're paying to these things. So people from academic political scientists to former politicians like Al Gore, through to Shimon Peres, the great Israeli statesman, who has described science and technology as fundamentally ungoverned, more important than politics. Now, this is a guy who spent his life doing peace and security politics, got a Nobel Prize for it. He's basically saying, folks, I'm over. He says the young people are all about science and technology. If you want to change the world, don't go into politics, become a scientist or a technological entrepreneur. So you've got these huge changes going on in the real world, huge new thinking going on academically.
Is politics following?
Politics is starting ever so slowly, one buzzword at a time, to catch up. And it's showing up in a lot of voting behaviors, actually, I think, more quickly than political actors really realize. It's already quite afoot.
Let me get John Ibbitson to follow up on that. You've got a book coming out called The Big Shift, in which you discuss some aspects of these. Do you want to follow up on what John Duffy had to say?
Well, I hope John is right, because it's one of the things we do talk about in the book. Right now, the environment just doesn't matter anymore. One reason that Stéphane Dion campaigned on the green shift in 2008, one reason that Barack Obama campaigned as well on environmental issues, was that 2007, when everyone was sort of formulating these policies, was a high water mark of concern for the environment, the high water mark of concern over global warming, for example, the year that Al Gore won his Nobel Prize. Pollsters will tell you that the environment is the canary in the mine. When people worry about the environment, it means that they're not worried about absolutely anything else. They have to worry about something, so they'll worry about melting ice caps. But as soon as a recession hits, for example, and jobs start to go south, and people begin to worry about their own personal economic future, the environment disappears as completely and as fully as it has disappeared in all polling data. And any politician who's worth his salt these days is not playing heavily on the environment because he knows it's not a vote winner. I know this is cruel and cynical, but in fact, it is the way politics is done. And however important scientists are, however powerful reason is in advancing technology and advancing new sciences, including sciences of the environment, those politicians will have their hands in the lever of power, and they'll decide what it is that gets done with this. And right now, there's just no sense out there that the people want those politicians to be pushing and pulling on those levers. They just want their jobs.
Armine, do you think new technology has become the enemy of equality?
Oh, quite the opposite. In John's speech, actually, he had a leitmotif going through it, which was who benefits. And so the question becomes over and over again as technological breakthroughs in medicine and life-enhancing and life-extending technologies occur in the ability to know everything whenever you want it for free. In artificial intelligence of all sorts that are going to open up technological frontiers that we can't dream of right now in terms of productivity enhancement.
But that manufacturing worker that we were talking about, who on not much education could raise a family, have a vacation.
So who benefits from these
he sure does
massive
not.
changes? And where I would take exception
Not
with
yet.
Shimon Peres is if you want to be in the future, get involved in technology, well, somehow you've got to be a split personality because you've got to be engaged in the politics of who benefits from these massive bursts forward. The SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act in the United States was very much about who controls this new intellectual commons. And we are in the middle of a triple revolution. We're in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, which is continuing to be expanded to low-wage countries as we speak. It might have been over here, we might have lost our manufacturing now, but manufacturing capacity is going all over the world. We're in the middle of a telecommunications and information revolution where we can know everything now, anywhere, in the same time as people on the other side of the world. And we're in a democratic revolution of a sort, which the Tahrir Square and Arab Spring protests against the status quo indicated that the next generation is not sitting by and saying whatever's happening is good enough. In fact, we're seeing it now beginning with the Foxconn workers in China. The Chinese young workers are also saying, we've done this now for a generation. When's it our time to score? So I think there's things bubbling, and it's really hard to govern something. I don't know that you can govern it, but there's got to be some interplay between market forces and how we talk about it for the political commons.
Duffy, then Coyne.
Well, the conventional breakdown right now of how any given technology issue goes is really well mapped, actually, by these Canadian political scientists. And it's been mapped very well by the Europeans. Basically, what you've got on any given technology question, for example, should genetically modified food have a little label on the package that says, you should know this is genetically modified? Now, this is an extremely lively debate. It's one that divides Republicans and Democrats, one that we haven't really seen in Canada. But the basic lineup is, you've got a position that says, look, this is good for people. There's no science in particular that says there's anything wrong with it. Bring it on, sort of pro-producer. And then you've got a pro-consumer viewpoint that says people should at least know this is sort of scary. There ought to be a little bit of control on this, or at least notice that kind of thing. On issue after issue, reproductive technology, at least in biotech, on reproductive technology, on GMO food, on genetic splicing, on the Human Genome Project and mapping genetic information, you'll find the same breakdown again and again and again. What's really interesting is that if you break things down like that, sure, one of them sounds like a right-wing position, and the other sounds like a left-wing position. But people who line up with a right-wing party in a politics that's about economics will not line up with the right-wing position in a politics that's about technology. And again, I go back to what I said in the speech, consider a rural evangelical voter on the role of government because they don't like government, because they are self-reliant in their values and their ethos and their traditions. They will vote conservative. But if you ask them about technology, they are very uneasy with the pro-producer, pro-business, go, bring it on, pro-technology position that is that of your typical conservative free market party. So this is going to move, the positions will stay familiar to us, but the voting bases aligned with them will move around underneath in hugely profound ways that will fundamentally reshape our politics. And as for John's point that this hasn't happened and that it's not the political game, I'm going to say something I've never said in all the years that I've been on your show, Steve. That's just wrong. I don't care about the politics. This is way more important how we govern technology than 2% on corporate tax. This is fundamental, and if our politicians aren't talking about it, shame on them, and they need to get serious.
2 minutes to go. Andrew, then John Ibbitson.
There's always been a tension at the core of the Conservative coalition, to pick up on what John's saying, between the advocates of free markets, which is inherently disruptive and modernizing, versus the more traditional thing. I think this emphasis on technology that John is talking about is bang on. Not technology fundamentally understood as an economic phenomenon, but as an existential one. Those clusters of technologies he's talking about, reproductive technologies, gene splicing, et cetera, have to do with what it is to be human. And that is a big question that I agree is going to become. On the economic side, I'm not so sure that we are in the midst of this maelstrom of of revolutionary industrial change. You're getting a lot of economists that I respect, people like Tyler Cowen or Robert J. Gordon, saying we may actually be entering in an era of much slower technological change than we've known basically from 1750 to 1950. That we may actually be, that may be the good old days, and that we're going to have to wring out productivity gains in other ways than counting upon endless innovations and inventions.
John Ibbitson, you want to bring...
Andrew, do you buy that?
I'm just throwing it out there.
He's throwing it out
I'm a
there.
techno-optimist by nature. I think things will come along, but I can't be, these are serious people.
He spends 25 hours a day on Twitter. He must love technology.
The other 25 he spends reading, so I don't know how he does it, folks.
John Ibbitson, we got a minute left. Bring it home and put a bow on it for us.
I think one thing we want to avoid is the temptation that is starting to get out there, which is that there are two parties in Canada, one of which is based on reason and one of which is based on some sort of atavistic emotive response. The Conservatives have made themselves vulnerable to that accusation, things that they did with National Research Council, things that they did with the census. But I get uncomfortable. For example, as much as I enjoyed Alan Gregg's post of a few weeks ago on this, with the notion that there is reason, which is liberal, and there is unreason, there is prejudice, which is conservative. I think if we try to polarize the debate in that way in Canada, it will fail, and those who try to present themselves as the party of reason, rather than just a party of one point of view, will find themselves alienating a whole lot of people who think that your reason is just your prejudice.
Thank you so much for doing that, John Ibbitson, and we look forward to reading your missives in the days and weeks and months and years ahead in the Globe and Mail. We thank you for being there on the line from the nation's capital for us tonight. And back here in studio, Armine Yalnizyan from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, John Duffy from Strategy Corp, Andrew Coyne from the National Post, and Twitter. All of the lectures mentioned in the program tonight were delivered at the Gardner Museum in downtown Toronto and are a co-production of Big Ideas and the LRC, the Literary Review of Canada. And you can find them all on the Big Ideas website. That's bigideas.tvo.org.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.